In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Carl Jung begins with his earliest years, a childhood spent mostly alone, drawing, imagining, and avoiding other children. He writes that he always felt two personalities in himself, the ordinary schoolboy and a quieter, older presence, watching everything from a distance. Jung recalls a moment that changed him. One day after school, another boy shoved him hard, and Jung hit his head on a stone. The next morning, on his way back to school, he suddenly collapsed in the street and lay there unable to move. Doctors found nothing wrong. Later he realized this wasn't an illness. It was his unconscious protecting him from a world he felt threatened by. That was the first time Jung understood. The mind is not one thing, but many forces acting beneath awareness. Childhood, to him, wasn't innocence. It was the first encounter with the hidden life inside us. In Chapter 2 of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Carl Jung describes school as the first place where he felt deeply misunderstood. He avoided other children, preferred being alone, and struggled to fit into the routine and discipline of school life. Jung shares one defining memory. A teacher accused him of cheating after he answered a question correctly. Jung hadn't cheated, he simply knew the answer. But the injustice shocked him so much that he began to distrust teachers and authority. Around this time, he discovered something else. Whenever school became too stressful, he would suddenly feel weak, dizzy, and collapse. Doctors again found nothing physically wrong. Jung later realized these episodes came from his psyche, protecting itself from pressure he didn't yet know how to handle. These early school years taught him that inner life is not optional. It reacts, defends, and speaks, even when we don't understand it. In Chapter 3 of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Carl Jung enters the period of his medical studies at the University of Basel. He writes that he chose medicine without a clear plan, but soon felt drawn to questions that went far beyond anatomy and physiology. The turning point came when he discovered a psychiatry textbook that described patients with unusual thoughts, hallucinations, and symbolic inner experiences. Jung realized instantly that this was the field where his curiosity belonged, the intersection of biology, inner life, and human meaning. During these years, he performed small experiments on himself, observing how emotions affected his heartbeat and breathing. He was not driven by pathology. He wanted to understand the boundary between the physical body and the unseen psychological forces that shaped behavior. At the same time, he developed a growing interest in religion, dreams, symbols, and the ancient ideas that modern science ignored. Jung later wrote that his student days did not prepare him to be a traditional doctor. They prepared him for the work of studying the human psyche, a field he soon realized he would have to explore almost entirely on his own. In Chapter 4 of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Carl Jung begins his work at the Burghölzli Psychiatric Clinic in Zurich, one of the most respected mental hospitals in Europe. Working with patients diagnosed with dementia praecox, he quickly saw what many psychiatrists missed. Their delusions weren't random. Jung began to notice something surprising. Patients who seemed completely disconnected from reality still showed consistent patterns in their dreams, drawings, and delusions. It was as if the unconscious mind was still speaking, just in a private language only it understood. To test this scientifically, Jung created the word association experiment. He would read a simple word like mother, anger, or home, and the patient had to respond with the first word that came to mind. What Jung looked for wasn't the answer itself, but the reaction. For Jung, this was the first demonstration that the unconscious wasn't a theory, but a real system influencing the body. Around this time, he also discovered the writings of Pierre Janet and Sigmund Freud. Their work on hysteria, trauma, and dreams resonated deeply with what he observed daily at the clinic. Chapter 4 marks the beginning of Jung's shift from medical doctor to psychological explorer, the moment psychiatry became a doorway into the deeper structure of the human mind. In Chapter 6 of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Carl Jung enters the most difficult period of his life, a personal fall into the unconscious. After his break with Freud, Jung felt the foundations of his world collapsing. He began having powerful visions and inner images that arrived without warning. Floods, fire, blood, symbolic scenes he didn't understand. Instead of suppressing them, he made a radical decision to face the unconscious directly. Jung describes sitting alone in his study, letting the images rise and writing down everything he saw and heard, not as hallucinations, but as messages from a deeper layer of the psyche. He paints, he draws, he dialogues with figures that speak in symbols and strange wisdom. This process terrified him. Some days he feared he was losing his mind. Other days he felt something ancient was trying to guide him through a psychological rebirth. Over time, he began to realize that the unconscious wasn't a place of chaos, but a source of creativity, healing, and meaning. The material he recorded during this period eventually became the foundation of the Red Book, and the birth of concepts like the shadow, the anima, and the collective unconscious. Chapter 6 marks the moment Jung discovers that confronting the inner world is not a breakdown, but the beginning of becoming whole. In Chapter 5 of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Carl Jung describes his first meeting with Sigmund Freud, a moment he considered a turning point in his life. Jung writes that when he met Freud in Vienna in 1907, they talked for 13 hours straight. Jung felt he had met a mind as bold and unconventional as his own. Freud, in turn, saw Jung as the most promising figure to carry psychoanalysis into the future. Their early relationship was one of deep respect. Jung admired Freud's courage in exploring taboo subjects, especially the role of sexuality in neurosis. But even in these first conversations, Jung noticed a tension. Freud seemed unwilling to question certain assumptions. Freud insisted that sexual theory was the foundation of all neurosis, and that challenging this idea could undermine the entire psychoanalytic movement. Jung respected Freud's work, but he sensed that the psyche was far more complex, filled with myth, symbol, and layers deeper than personal sexuality. He also felt Freud was too protective of psychoanalysis, treating criticism like a personal threat rather than scientific debate. The friendship remained strong for years, but this early philosophical divide would eventually grow into an irreparable split. Chapter 5 marks the beginning of Jung's relationship with Freud, a bond that shaped his path and pushed him toward developing a psychology grounded not only in personal history, but in the symbolic and collective depths of the human mind. In Chapter 7 of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung explains what he actually did with the overwhelming inner material that had erupted in his life. This chapter isn't about visions or fear, it's about method. Jung realized he couldn't simply wait for the unconscious to speak. He needed a structured way to meet it halfway. So he began a daily discipline he later called active imagination, sitting at his desk, quieting his thoughts, and deliberately inviting an inner image to appear. Whatever arrived, a scene, a figure, a voice, he didn't interpret it. He entered it. He asked questions. He let the dialogue unfold as if he were speaking with a real person. Then he documented everything with precision, painting the figures, copying their exact words, and recording their behavior as carefully as a scientist observing a specimen. Over time, he realized something unusual. These inner figures had autonomy. They resisted. They corrected him. They expressed ideas he hadn't consciously considered. This is where his later theories took shape: the archetypes, the inner guide, and the understanding that the psyche is not a machine, but a living system with its own intelligence. Chapter 7 is the turning point where Jung stops treating his inner world as pathology and begins treating it as work. Disciplined, intentional, the foundation of everything he created afterward. In Chapter 8 of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung finally explains the purpose of the Red Book, not the experiences behind it, but the creation of the book itself. He describes it as a large red leather manuscript where he copied, illustrated, and refined the material that first appeared during his inner crisis. The original fantasies were written quickly in black notebooks. But the Red Book was different. It was deliberate. Jung transferred the episodes by hand, rewriting them in elaborate Gothic calligraphy on thick parchment pages. He illuminated the margins with paintings of mandalas, mythic figures, and symbolic landscapes, not as decoration, but as an attempt to give the unconscious an objective, visible form. Jung says the spirit of the depths compelled him to do this. It wasn't enough to experience the inner world. He had to shape it, translate it into a physical reality, where others could see what the psyche reveals when the ego steps aside. He worked on this book for 16 years, sometimes abandoning it for months, then returning with new insight. He admits he didn't know whether he was creating psychology, theology, or art. What he did know was that the Red Book preserved the origins of his entire later system, his understanding of symbols, myth, the self, and the process of individuation. Chapter 8 is not about Jung's visions. It's about his attempt to build a bridge between the inner world and the outer one, and bind it into a book that he kept hidden for the rest of his life. In Chapter 9 of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung describes a period in his life when dreams and visions began pulling him into what he called the realm of the dead. Not a place of ghosts, but a symbolic world connected to the psyche's deepest layers. He writes that the dead weren't separate from the living. They represented everything forgotten, unlived, unresolved, or unfinished in human history and in the individual soul. During this time, Jung felt as if he were carrying the weight of generations, dreams filled with ancient cities, ancestral figures, and voices speaking with timeless authority. He came to believe that the unconscious wasn't just personal, it was collective, containing the psychological heritage of the entire human past. These experiences weren't pleasant or mystical. Often they were overwhelming, forcing Jung to confront fear, loneliness, and the possibility that he might be losing touch with reality. But he interpreted them as messages from the deeper layers of the psyche, a demand that he acknowledge the ancient forces shaping every human life. Jung realized that the realm of the dead symbolized the forgotten parts of the self, the ancestral patterns we inherit, and the myths that quietly guide our behavior even when we don't notice them. Chapter 9 marks Jung's discovery that the unconscious isn't a private basement. It's a vast landscape that connects the living to history, culture, and the entire human story. In Chapter 10 of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung describes a series of intense visions that began shortly before the First World War. One of the most striking was a flood sweeping across Europe, destroying cities and leaving only a few survivors. At first, Jung feared it reflected a collapse in his own psyche. But when the war broke out months later, he realized these images were not personal. They were symbolic expressions of a collective crisis already approaching. This insight became central to his psychology, that the unconscious isn't limited to the individual, but is connected to the whole of humanity. Jung also encountered mythic figures and landscapes that felt older than history, presences that challenged and guided him. For Jung, these visions showed that the psyche doesn't only look backward toward the personal past, it also anticipates cultural change and reveals deeper patterns moving through the world. In Chapter 11 of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung explores a subject most psychologists avoid: the possibility that consciousness survives death. He doesn't argue for religion or belief. Instead, he turns to the evidence that came from his own dreams, visions, and a profound near-death experience he had after a heart attack in 1944. Jung describes floating high above the earth, seeing the world as a luminous blue sphere, while feeling a deep peace, unlike anything in ordinary life. He felt he was approaching a vast stone temple, a place that seemed to exist outside time, and sensed that if he went any further, he would never return. He says this experience convinced him that consciousness is not limited to the physical body. Jung also believed that dreams of the dead were not fantasies, but encounters with layers of the psyche containing wisdom older than the individual. For him, the question of life after death was not about proof, but about understanding that the psyche is larger than biological life. Chapter 11 reveals Jung's central insight. Consciousness may change form, but its essence is part of a reality that does not end. In the final chapter of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Carl Jung looks back on his life with the understanding that the psyche is far bigger than any theory he ever created. He says that as he grew older, certainty faded and mystery became more important than knowledge. Jung believed that the human mind lives between two realities: the world outside and the inner world that continues shaping us long after childhood. He writes that the question of meaning becomes unavoidable with age. Not meaning as a goal, but meaning as a relationship between the conscious ego and the deeper self that guides us through dreams, symbols, and moments of intuition. Jung also reflects on religion, saying it is not about dogma, but about maintaining a living connection with the inner source of transformation. And after a lifetime studying the psyche, Jung concludes with humility, "I do not know what life is, nor what death is. I only know the images the psyche has shown me." Chapter 12 is Jung's final message. The task of life is not to solve the mystery, but to stay in dialogue with it.